The wind howled through the barren Arctic expanse, a relentless force that carved its fury into the frozen landscape. The sky was a blanket of shifting gray, the sun little more than a ghostly ember in the heavens, barely rising before it slipped below the horizon once more. The land was a graveyard of ice, where life clung desperately to the edges of existence. In the heart of this desolation, a solitary figure moved through the snow, Dr. Elias Halloway, a seasoned wildlife researcher with years of experience studying Arctic predators. His boots crunched against the frost-hardened ground as he followed a set of tracks partially obscured by the wind's fury. They were fresh, unmistakably those of a bear, but something about them set his nerves on edge. The gait was irregular, erratic, as if the creature had been wounded or, worse, hunted by something unseen. Elias adjusted his thermal goggles and peered into the distance, his breath curling into mist before vanishing into the abyss of cold. He had spent years in the Arctic, documenting the dwindling populations of polar bears, but he had never seen tracks like these. There was an unnatural depth to them, as if something far heavier than a bear had pressed into the ice. He shuddered, though not from the cold. His radio crackled to life. "Elias, do you copy?" The voice of Dr. Meredith Carter, his colleague at the research station, cut through the static. "Yeah, I'm here," he replied, kneeling to examine the tracks. "You need to head back. A storm is moving in faster than expected." Elias glanced at the sky. The clouds churned in ominous swirls, darkening by the second. He knew Arctic storms were unpredictable, capable of swallowing an entire expedition in minutes. But something about these tracks, it gnawed at him. "I need a little more time," he said. Meredith hesitated before answering. "Fine. But don't go too far. If you lose visibility, we might not be able to find you." Elias acknowledged and pressed forward. The tracks led him to the edge of a frozen lake, a vast, eerie expanse of ice stretching endlessly in all directions. His heart pounded. In the middle of the lake, partially buried in the snow, was something massive. A carcass. Elias moved closer, his breath hitching as the full sight came into view. It was a polar bear, one of the largest he had ever seen, but its body was twisted unnaturally, as if it had been ravaged by some unseen force. Deep, jagged gashes ran along its torso, the flesh frozen solid. The most unsettling part, however, was its face. The bear's eyes were wide open, but the pupils were gone, leaving only milky, empty sockets that stared into the abyss. Its jaw hung slack, frozen mid-snarl. Elias swallowed hard. Something had killed this apex predator, something strong enough to rip through thick muscle and bone like paper. A sound broke through the silence. A low, guttural growl. Elias spun, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The wind had died suddenly, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. His heart thundered in his chest as he scanned the desolate landscape, searching for the source. But there was nothing, just the endless white, stretching into oblivion. And then, the ice beneath him groaned. A slow, creeping crack slithered outward from where he stood, spiderwebbing toward the bear's carcass. Elias took a step back, but something was wrong. The ice was shifting in a way that defied nature, moving not from pressure but as if something beneath it was stirring. He turned to run. The ice exploded behind him, sending a shockwave of freezing shards into the air. Elias barely managed to stay on his feet as he sprinted toward the shoreline. Behind him, a deep, echoing roar reverberated through the air, an inhuman sound, something ancient and hungry. He didn't stop running until he reached the edge of the lake, gasping for breath. When he finally turned back, the bear's carcass was gone. The ice had swallowed it whole. Back at the research station, Meredith paced anxiously as the wind howled outside. The storm had arrived, its fury rattling the steel walls of the outpost. She checked her watch, frowning. Elias should have been back by now. A sudden knock at the door made her jump. She rushed over, flinging it open. Elias stumbled inside, his face pale, his hands trembling. He collapsed onto the nearest chair, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Jesus, Elias, what happened?" Meredith grabbed a blanket and wrapped it around his shoulders. Elias shook his head, eyes wide with something between fear and disbelief. I found a bear," he stammered. But it wasn't normal. It was mutilated. And then, something was there. Meredith frowned. Something? Elias swallowed. Something beneath the ice. Meredith's expression darkened. She had heard whispers from the Inuit elders in the nearby settlement, stories of creatures that lurked beneath the frozen lakes, waiting for the right moment to rise. Legends of spirits, hunters from a time before men. She glanced out the window. The storm had thickened, turning the world outside into an impenetrable void of white. "We shouldn't have come here," she whispered. Elias looked at her, his mind replaying the moment the ice cracked, the echoing roar that had chased him. Somewhere, out there in the frozen wasteland, something ancient had stirred. And it wasn't done hunting. The research station groaned under the weight of the Arctic storm, the wind outside slamming against the metal walls like a beast demanding entry. Inside, the dim fluorescent lights flickered as Elias sat at the small wooden table, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee that did little to chase away the cold embedded in his bones. Meredith sat across from him, eyes filled with concern. "Tell me again," she said, voice steady but laced with unease. Elias exhaled slowly. "I followed a bear's tracks. They led me to a carcass, one of the biggest polar bears I've ever seen, but it was wrong. Something had torn into it, like it had been mauled by something much stronger. And its eyes," he hesitated, the image seared into his mind. "They were completely white." Meredith folded her arms. "And then the ice moved?" "It didn't just move." Elias looked up at her. "It swallowed the body. 1 second it was there, the next it was gone. And I heard something. A sound that—" He shook his head. It wasn't natural. Silence hung between them, punctuated only by the howling wind outside. Meredith chewed her lip before standing and grabbing a leather-bound notebook from one of the shelves. She flipped through the pages until she found what she was looking for and turned the book toward Elias. "Have you ever heard of the Kalapalik?" she asked. Elias frowned at the hand-drawn sketch, a humanoid figure with elongated limbs, sunken eyes, and dark, jagged skin. It lurked beneath a sheet of ice, claws stretching toward an unsuspecting victim standing above. "It's an Inuit legend," Meredith explained. "A creature that lives beneath the frozen lakes. According to the stories, it takes those who wander too close to thin ice. Some say it calls to them, whispering their name in the wind." Elias scoffed, though the unease in his chest remained. "You're saying I saw a monster?" "I'm saying the people who have lived in these lands for generations believe there's something out there." Meredith tapped the notebook. "We'd be foolish to dismiss that." Elias ran a hand down his face. "Look, I'm not saying I believe in myths. But I know what I saw. And whatever it was, it's still out there." A sudden, sharp thud rattled the station, cutting through the storm's howling. Both researchers snapped to attention. "What the hell was that?" Meredith whispered. Elias stood, heart hammering. Something hit the station. They moved cautiously to the reinforced window, peering out into the swirling white abyss. At first, they saw nothing. Just the storm raging, snow and ice whipping through the air in a chaotic frenzy. But then, something shifted in the distance. A shape. Moving. Elias grabbed the station's high-powered flashlight and flicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. And there it was. A polar bear. But not just any bear. It was the one from the lake. Its massive form stood just beyond the edge of the light, hunched and unmoving. The deep gashes Elias had seen before were still visible, but something was different now. Its fur, once a pristine white, was now tinged with an unnatural gray, as though frost and shadow had seeped into its very being. And its eyes, they were still hollow, still empty, still dead. Yet the bear was moving. Meredith gasped. "That's impossible." The bear took a step forward, then another, and then it opened its mouth. The sound that poured forth was not a growl. It was something far worse. A low, distorted wail, like the cry of a child lost in the wind, yet layered with something deeper, something ancient and hungry. It rattled through the air, slipping into their ears, coiling around their minds like a sickness. Elias staggered back, hands clamping over his ears. Meredith did the same, her face contorted in pain. The bear took another step, its movements jerky, unnatural, like something was wearing its skin rather than living inside it. Then it stopped. The wind howled, and the thing that was once a bear tilted its head unnaturally. And then, it spoke. A voice slithered from its throat, twisted and gurgling, as though the words were being forced through water and ice. Should not. Here. The flashlight flickered. The radio behind them crackled with static. Then the lights cut out. Darkness swallowed the station. A sharp, deafening bang shook the walls as something heavy slammed against the door. Elias and Meredith scrambled back, hearts pounding as the reinforced metal groaned under the pressure. A second bang. Then a third. Silence. Only the wind remained, whispering through the cracks in the station's foundation. Meredith, breathing hard, reached out and clicked the emergency backup lights on. A dim red glow bathed the room in eerie illumination. Elias swallowed hard and moved cautiously toward the door. "Are you insane?" Meredith hissed. "That thing is still out there." But when Elias peered through the narrow slit in the reinforced door, his breath caught in his throat. The bear was gone. All that remained were deep, gouging claw marks along the station's exterior. And in the snow, directly outside the door, was a trail of footprints. But they weren't bear tracks. They were human. The research station sat in suffocating silence, save for the howl of the Arctic wind and the distant groaning of the ice shifting under unseen forces. The dim red emergency lighting bathed the small interior in an ominous glow, making the shadows seem longer, deeper, almost alive. Elias and Meredith stood frozen near the entrance, their breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. The monstrous bear, if it could even be called that anymore, had disappeared into the storm, leaving behind something even more disturbing. The human footprints. Elias gripped the edge of the table to steady himself. "This doesn't make any sense." Meredith, still staring at the tracks outside, swallowed hard. "First, a dead bear walks. Then it speaks. And now we have this." She turned to face him, eyes dark with fear. "Elias, what if whatever was in that bear isn't gone? What if it's inside something else now?" Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Arctic air. He moved toward the window again, shining his flashlight into the storm. Snow whipped violently in the wind, making visibility nearly impossible. But there, just beyond the reach of the light, something moved. A figure. Not the bear. Something taller. Human-shaped. Elias recoiled. "There's someone out there?" Meredith sucked in a sharp breath. "That's impossible. No one else is supposed to be within 100 miles of this station." Elias gritted his teeth. "Then tell me why there's a person standing in the storm." The figure didn't move. It just stood there watching. The wind battered it, but it remained unnaturally still. It twitched. A sharp, jerking motion, like a puppet whose strings had been yanked too hard. Then it took a step. Another. And then it vanished. Not into the storm. Not into the distance. It simply blinked out of existence. Meredith grabbed Elias's arm, fingers digging into his sleeve. "We need to leave." "No." Elias barely had time to nod before the radio crackled to life. At first, it was just static. A voice. The transmission was garbled, distorted by interference, but it was undeniably a voice. A voice Elias recognized. His blood ran cold. He hesitated, pulse hammering. "It's Dr. Jameson." Meredith's face paled. "That's not possible." Dr. Thomas Jameson had been one of their colleagues, stationed at a separate Arctic outpost 5 years ago. That outpost had been lost to the ice. All personnel had been presumed dead. Elias grabbed the radio. "Dr. Jameson? Can you hear me?" More static. "Wrong, not Jameson anymore." The signal cut out. Elias stared at the radio, his mind racing. Meredith took a shaky step back. "Tell me I didn't just hear that." Elias turned to her, his grip tightening around the radio. "We're not alone out here." Meredith opened her mouth to respond. Then the station shook. Not from the storm. From something else. A deep, resounding boom echoed through the walls, followed by the sharp sound of ice cracking beneath them. Meredith's eyes darted to the floor. "The ice is breaking." The The station isn't stable. Elias grabbed their emergency gear, tossing a pack to Meredith. We need to move. If we stay here, we might end up in the same place as that other outpost. Meredith hesitated. And where do you think they ended up? Elias didn't have an answer. The radio, still in his hand, buzzed with static again. Then, in a voice that did not belong to Dr. Jameson, a whisper slithered through the speaker. You shouldn't have seen it. A sharp knock rattled the door. Elias and Meredith both turned, dread thick in the air. Another knock. Then another. A voice from the other side. Let me in. It wasn't human. It wasn't alive. Elias took a step back as the door handle twisted. Meredith clamped a hand over her mouth, eyes wide with horror. The knocking stopped. Silence. And then, the sound of something crawling. Not footsteps. Not the slow, heavy gait of something walking. But the skittering of something moving on all fours. The sound of nails scraping against metal. Then the vent above them rattled. Elias's breath caught in his throat. Meredith whispered, voice barely audible. It's inside. A single droplet of freezing water dripped from the vent onto the floor. Then another. Elias's hand shot out, grabbing Meredith's wrist. We run. No. She didn't argue. They bolted for the secondary exit, a reinforced hatch leading to the snowmobiles outside. As Elias reached for the handle, something slammed into the other side. A single, low voice vibrated through the metal. You belong to the ice now. The hatch burst open, sending them both stumbling out into the frozen wasteland. Behind them, inside the station, the red emergency lights flickered. And then they went out, leaving whatever was inside in total darkness. The Arctic wind slammed into Elias and Meredith as they stumbled away from the research station, their breath coming in ragged gasps, crystallizing instantly in the frigid air. Behind them, the station stood in eerie silence, its darkened windows staring out like dead eyes. Elias gripped Meredith's wrist, pulling her toward the two snowmobiles parked just outside the storage shed. The storm raged around them, snow swirling in chaotic gusts, making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Meredith fumbled with her snow goggles, her voice barely audible over the wind. We can't just run blindly into the storm. We need a plan. Elias fought against the panic clawing at his chest. The supply outpost, about 20 miles south. It has backup power, a radio, shelter. Meredith hesitated, glancing back at the station. What if we're just walking into something worse? A sudden, sharp noise cut through the wind. A metallic groan. Both of them froze. The research station shifted. Not from the storm. Something beneath it moved. The ground trembled slightly, a deep, resonating vibration that sent ice fractures racing across the surface. Elias barely had time to react before the radio in his coat pocket crackled to life. A whisper slid through the static. You cannot run. A second voice followed, warped and layered, like multiple voices speaking as one. You belong to the ice. The station collapsed. The reinforced metal walls buckled inward, like a giant hand had reached up from below and dragged it down. The entire structure folded in on itself, sinking into the snow and ice as if the ground had simply opened up to consume it. Meredith screamed. Elias grabbed her and yanked her toward the snowmobiles. No more waiting. We're leaving. Now. They scrambled onto their vehicles, Elias starting his engine first. The roar of the motor was a lifeline against the oppressive silence of the Arctic. Meredith's machine sputtered but finally came to life. Then behind them, a shadow rose from the ruins of the research station. Elias didn't look. He didn't want to see it. Instead, he gunned the accelerator, his snowmobile jerking forward as he tore into the storm. Meredith followed close behind, her headlights barely visible through the swirling frost. They raced into the unknown, the frozen wasteland stretching endlessly in every direction. The wind howled, but something else lurked within it, soft, almost human voices whispering just beneath the surface of the storm. Then, a voice, clear, unnatural, right in Elias's ear. You are heading the wrong way. Elias jerked violently, nearly losing control of the snowmobile. his breath caught in his throat. The voice hadn't come from the radio. It had come from inside his helmet. Meredith must have heard something too because she suddenly veered closer, her voice trembling through the comms. Elias, someone's whispering my name. Elias forced himself to focus. Ignore it. Just keep moving. The snow beneath them seemed endless, an ocean of white stretching toward nothingness. But Elias knew the supply outpost had to be ahead. He checked the GPS strap to his wrist. The screen flickered, then died. Meredith's voice crackled. Elias, my GPS just shut off. A sick feeling twisted in his stomach. They're messing with us. Meredith's headlights flickered beside him. What do you mean they? Before Elias could answer, the ice fractured beneath them. Meredith screamed as her snowmobile dropped, sinking as a massive crack split open the ground. Elias slammed on his brakes, skidding to a stop just before the chasm. Meredith? She barely clung to the edge of the ice, her snowmobile already swallowed by the darkness below. Elias threw himself from his vehicle, reaching for her. Hold on. Her fingers, red and raw from the cold, clawed at the frozen surface. It's pulling me down. Elias grabbed her wrists, pulling with everything he had. But it was like something beneath was dragging her downward. A sound rose from the darkness. A deep, distorted moan, like the ice itself was crying out in hunger. Hands emerged from the black void beneath her. Not human hands. Long, twisted fingers, gray and frozen, reaching for her ankles. Meredith shrieked, kicking wildly. No. Elias. Elias roared as he wrenched her free, using all his strength to yank her onto solid ground. They both collapsed in the snow, gasping. Meredith trembled violently. I felt them. They were cold. They were pulling me down. Elias looked at the fissure. It stretched deep, an endless abyss of darkness beneath the ice. Something looked back. Deep in the chasm, just beyond the reach of the fading light, eyes gleamed in the darkness. Dozens of them. Unblinking. Watching. A voice rose from below, layered and inhuman. You should not be here. The ice shifted. The crack widened. Elias grabbed Meredith's arm. Run. They sprinted back to Elias's snowmobile. He didn't hesitate. He hauled Meredith onto the seat behind him, slammed the accelerator, and tore away from the collapsing ice. Behind them, the abyss yawned wider, swallowing everything in its path. The whispers rose to a deafening wail, the voices screaming in their ears. Then silence. They didn't stop until the supply outpost loomed ahead, a small dark structure barely visible through the storm. Elias skidded to a halt, breathing ragged. Meredith clung to him, shaking uncontrollably. They had made it, but something had followed. A shadow loomed at the edge of the storm, just beyond the reach of the outpost's lights. Twisted. Watching. And behind it, beneath the ice, the whispering continued. The supply outpost stood in eerie silence, its walls coated in frost, its windows dark like hollowed-out eyes staring into the storm. Elias and Meredith staggered off the snowmobile, their bodies stiff from the bone-chilling cold. The whispering voices had faded, but they could still feel something watching from the storm. Meredith clutched Elias's arm, her breath coming in ragged gasps. It followed us. Elias turned, scanning the swirling white void behind them. Just at the edge of visibility, a shape moved, tall, misshapen, watching. It didn't advance, but it didn't leave either. It waited. Elias gritted his teeth. Inside. Now, they stumbled toward the outpost, their boots crunching on the frozen ground. The door was locked, but Elias yanked a crowbar from his pack and jammed it between the hinges, forcing it open with a metallic screech. They tumbled inside, slamming the door behind them. Darkness. Only the dim red glow of the backup generator illuminated the small interior. Metal shelves lined the walls, filled with canned food, fuel, and old radio equipment. A single desk sat in the corner, coated in a fine layer of frost. Meredith wrapped her arms around herself. Start the generator. We need power. Elias nodded, moving toward the back room where the emergency power controls were housed. He flipped the first switch. A dull whirring sound filled the silence as the generator rumbled to life. The lights flickered. Not from a power issue. From something else. Meredith inhaled sharply. Elias? Elias turned. His stomach dropped. The room was no longer empty. A figure stood in the doorway. It was a man, or at least, it used to be. His skin was sickly gray, his lips cracked and frozen over. Ice clung to his tattered parka, and his eyes. His eyes were black holes. Empty. Consuming. Meredith took a step back, her voice trembling. No, it's not possible. Elias recognized him too. Dr. Thomas Jameson. A man who had died 5 years ago. Jameson's head twitched unnaturally, his lips barely parting as a cold, breathless whisper crawled from his throat. The ice does not forget. Then his face cracked. Like shattering glass, his frozen skin splintered apart, revealing something dark and writhing beneath. Something not human. Elias grabbed Meredith and bolted toward the back exit. But the door was gone. Not just blocked, as if the outpost itself was shifting, changing around them. Meredith spun, pressing herself against the wall. Elias, what's happening? Jameson's voice came again, from everywhere. You are part of the ice now. The walls cracked open. Not just the walls, the floor, the ceiling, the air itself. The entire outpost fractured, breaking like fragile ice, revealing a darkness beneath that stretched forever. And within it, the voices. Hundreds, thousands of whispers, rising in a chorus of hunger, grief, and rage. Meredith screamed as the ground collapsed beneath her feet. Elias lunged, grabbing her wrist just as the darkness below opened its maw. Something moved in the void. A shape. A titanic, skeletal form, twisting in the abyss, its frozen ribs shifting like the plates of a glacier. Its eyes, black and endless, stared directly into Elias's soul. Then it spoke. The ice remembers all who die here. Elias felt his grip slipping. Meredith's fingers, ice cold and stiff, started to slip from his grasp. No, I won't let go. Meredith's face was pale, her lips blue. Her eyes met his, and in that moment she whispered, "It won't let us leave." Elias refused to accept that. With every ounce of strength he had left, he pulled. Meredith's body lurched upward, just as the void screamed. A sound not meant for human ears, a wail that shattered reality. Everything went white. A sudden, blinding flash. The sensation of falling. And then, silence. The aftermath. Elias woke to the sound of the wind. He was lying in the snow, staring up at the pale Arctic sky. The storm was gone. The supply outpost was gone. Everything was gone. He sat up with a sharp gasp, his breath coming in heavy bursts. Meredith? She was beside him, motionless. But breathing. Elias grabbed her shoulders. Meredith! Wake up! Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused. Then, realization dawned, and she bolted upright, shivering violently. "Let us go," she whispered. Elias swallowed hard, his body still aching from whatever had happened. Not they. Whatever was beneath the ice, whatever had consumed the others, had chosen to spare them. For what? Elias glanced around. The landscape was eerily untouched, as if none of it had happened. But he knew better. The Arctic did not forget. And as they stood, shaking, staring into the endless frozen horizon, one last whisper rode the wind. So subtle. You will return. Elias turned toward Meredith, his voice hoarse. We need to leave this place. Meredith nodded. But deep down, they both knew the truth. The ice had claimed them. Even if they left, it would always call them back.